Welcome and thank you for attending the Black History Matters series presented by the National Abolition Hall of Fame and Museum. My name is Victoria Basurto and I will now lead you through some introductory statements. I am a current senior at Colgate University, located in Hamilton, New York, and an intern at the National Abolition Hall of Fame and Museum. I will be facilitating the series of 28 presentations that will be released throughout the month of February 2021 and that you can view on our YouTube channel or on our website. The National Abolition Hall of Fame and Museum is located in Peterborough, New York, in the building that you can see on the screen, where the inaugural meeting of the New York State Anti-Slavery Society was held in 1835. NAHOF's mission is as follows. The National Abolition Hall of Fame and Museum honors anti-slavery abolitionists, their work to end slavery, and the legacy of that struggle, and strives to complete the second and ongoing abolition, the moral conviction to end racism. NAHOF has worked in coordination with the Garrett Smith Estate National Historic Landmark, which is also located in Peterborough, New York, to create the Black History Matters series. The following statement is the purpose of the Black History Matters series that you can read on the screen. NAHOF supports racial justice movements seeking to address racial inequality given their resonance with NAHOF's mission to address the second and ongoing abolition to end racism. NAHOF believes a significant number of Americans do not understand the current racial justice protests due to their unfamiliarity with 4 centuries of Black American history, because this history was either excluded or taught inadequately in schools. NAHOF knows that education is a powerful step towards ending racism, and that understanding the history of the enslavement and dehumanization of Black Americans provides critical context for the ongoing racial justice movements and the persistence of racism in America. Given NAHOF's commitment to strengthening knowledge of history as one route to confront racism, NAHOF will present Black History Matters, a series of crash courses covering some examples of neglected topics in Black American history, in February of 2021. Okay, so today we're going to be talking about how slavery came to an end in the state of New York. Now, the end of slavery in New York is different than how slavery came to an end in many southern states after the end of the Civil War. The state of New York actually began a gradual process of freeing its slaves beginning in 1799, which seems strange to me as someone who grew up in Texas and only learned about the end of slavery in the United States as coming abruptly after the end of the Civil War. So, a brief recap on the origins of slavery in New York would help us understand how and why this process worked out the way that it did. In an earlier presentation, I mentioned how the first enslaved Africans arrived for the first time in an English colony in the Americas. This happened in 1619 in the colony of Virginia. The origin of slavery in New York was a bit different. Slavery in New York began under the Dutch slave trade, as the colony of New York was controlled by the Dutch, who called it New Netherland, before it was taken over by the English in 1664. Prior to that, however, the Dutch West India Company imported its first 11 African slaves to New Amsterdam, otherwise known as New York City today, in 1626, with the first slave auction being held in 1655. The picture you see on the screen is a woodcut held by the North Wind Picture Archives of an enslaved family being sold in a slave auction in Virginia. One can imagine the slave auctions in New York would look similar. Under the control of the English, the slave trade continued and so did slavery in New York. In 1703, 42% of households in New York City had slaves. Additionally, enslaved people were used for farming in other parts of the colony, such as in Long Island and the Hudson Valley. Thus, the legacy of slavery in New York went back several years and had made a significant impact before the beginning of its abolition in 1799. The image that you see is a lined photo engraving by Harry Fenn of the New York slave market in 1730, found in Woodrow Wilson's A History of the American People via the New York Public Library. So as a brief recap about the end of slavery in the United States, Slavery did not officially end in the United States until the 13th Amendment was ratified in 1865. We will have an entire presentation with Dr. Hogle devoted to covering the implications of the 13th Amendment at a later date. But as a brief summary, the 13th Amendment stated that neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as a punishment for crime whereof the party shall have been duly convicted, shall exist within the United States or any place subject to their jurisdiction. This came, of course, after the end of the Civil War, with the defeat of the slave states in the South. During the Civil War, President Abraham Lincoln had actually taken the first steps to abolish slavery through the Emancipation Proclamation of 1863, which abolished slavery in the rebelling states of the Confederacy and not within the entirety of the United States. The image that you see on the screen is a scanned copy of the 5-page original proclamation held in the National Archives building. It reads, quote, that on the first day of January in the year of our Lord, 1863, all persons held as slaves within any state or designated part of a state, the people whereof shall then be in rebellion against the United States, shall be then thenceforward and forever free. And the executive government of the United States, including the military and naval authority thereof, will recognize and maintain the freedom of such persons, and will do no act or acts to repress such persons or any of them in any effort they make for their actual freedom. So yes, the emancipation freed around 3.5 million enslaved people that lived in states that had been sided with the Confederacy and in rebellion. But they were only free once they escaped the Confederate controlled areas by running away into Union territory, or if they were still within the Confederate territory after the Union victory. However, the official abolition of slavery in the whole country would not come until 2 years later in the 13th Amendment. In contrast to this, New York State began the process of abolishing slavery through the New York laws of 1799. The image that you see on the screen is the laws of 1799, kept in the New York State Archives. You can see a full transcript of what the law says in the New York State Archives, but I will highlight some main points. So I'm going to read a little bit of a transcript. Quote, be it enacted by the people of the state of New York represented in Senate and Assembly, that any child born of a slave within this state after the 4th day of July next shall be deemed and adjudged to be born free, provided nevertheless that such child shall be the servant of the legal proprietor of his or her mother until such servant of a male shall arrive at the age of 28, and if a female at the age of 25 years. So the main takeaways are that the law, signed on March 29, 1799, allowed for any child born to a slave mother after July 4th, 1799, to be declared legally free after reaching the age of 28 if they were male and 25 if they were female. Any enslaved person born before that will remain a slave for the rest of their life, except that they will now be called indentured servants instead of slaves. This gradual abolition of slavery was meant to allow owners to recoup the profit from their slaves before losing them. This law was actually modeled after a similar law in Pennsylvania and made New York State the second to last northern state to emancipate enslaved people. Some other key points that are outlined in this law are that children of the master can inherit the debt of the enslaved person until they reach a certain age. So for example, if a man dies owning a 15-year-old enslaved girl, the man's heir, probably his son, will inherit the enslaved girl until she reaches the age of 25, or 28 if the person is a male. Another part mentioned in this law is that a slave owner had to show a baby to a town clerk within 9 months of that child's birth to register its correct age and receive a certificate which would have its official age. If the person delayed the registration of the child, they would be fined $1 per month that they delayed the registration, which there was obviously incentive to do because the longer you delayed the registration, the more likely the child was going to last longer under your service, given that they would be registered incorrectly in terms of age. This law complicated the way New Yorkers saw Black people and their role within society. Many saw this as a harbinger for absolute abolition, and thus many slave owners were convinced by those who would eventually be set free to grant them early manumission. Additionally, gradual changes were made to this law over the years, but the biggest came in March 31st, 1817, when the act relative to slaves and servants, um, which you can see on the screen, also available at the New York State Archives, set a timeline for the emancipation of all slaves, including those born before July 4th, 1799, to be set free by July 4th, 1827. On that day, roughly about 4,600 or 11% of the Black population living in New York was set free. However, despite emancipation in 1827, rights for Black people were still severely restricted. For example, the 1821 state constitution barred large amounts of free Blacks from voting by eliminating property qualifications for white men at the New York Constitutional Convention, but leaving these same property requirements in for Black men, indicating even before emancipation of enslaved people that white New Yorkers were still not open to granting Black people full citizenship in society. Black men would not obtain equal voting rights in New York until the ratification of the 15th Amendment in 1870. And that, of course, would come with its own set of challenges. We will actually see some of these challenges at a future presentation on John Lewis. And this image on the screen is of an 1879 cartoon in Harper's Magazine, satirizing the requirement that Black people pass a literacy test to be able to vote, despite the fact that the Uncle Sam character in this image is misspelling all the rules. One last thing of interest is to see just how the enslaved population fell in New York State. According to the census and the New York Historical Society, while in the 1820s, the New York census found that there were 10,088 people listed as slaves, the 1830 census showed that there were only 75 enslaved people in New York State, and the 1840 census listed 4 enslaved people in New York. This demonstrates how slow moving the process of emancipation was and the difficulty with which New Yorkers let go of slavery in a state that had come to rely on them. The City University of New York states that this is possible, that these remaining slaves were people that were probably born after the year 1799 and were still completing the years of service required under the Emancipation Law, which is why there were still people listed as enslaved even after emancipation. In their analysis of the census records, the City University of New York also highlighted the many ways in which slavery continued to exist in New York even after emancipation. For example, the 1870 law permitted, quote, slave owners to bring enslaved people into New York State for up to 9 months, effectively recognizing enslavement based on the laws and practices of other jurisdictions, end quote. Thus, they accepted out-of-state enslaved people to exist legally as slaves within New York for some time. Likewise, the New York ports allowed slave ships to anchor and restock. This was decided in a federal court decision, US v. D'Souza in 1838, which found that slave ships were permitted to dock at New York Harbor to carry slaves as long as they were not transferred or sold in New York. Lastly, laws like the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 kept challenging New Yorkers to choose a side on slavery. Join us tomorrow for a presentation by Norman Dan on the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 to learn how Northerners reacted to the law and its effect on the anti-slavery movement. So thank you so much for joining me today on this educational presentation about the abolition of slavery in New York. If you're interested in learning more about this topic, I have provided a reference list of sources with websites that you can explore to learn more in the video description. Likewise, I will invite you to fill out a quick survey linked beneath the video in the description, which will help us gather feedback about the specific topic. This survey will take you no more than 5 minutes to fill out and will provide us with valuable information that will help us in the formation of future presentations like this one. Lastly, should you have any questions regarding this presentation itself, I have made my email available on the screen, so that you may contact me with any questions or comments about the presentation. Additionally, please do contact NAHOF with any questions or if you're interested in learning more about the organization and its work. NAHOF's contact information is available on the screen. Once again, thank you so much for joining me in this presentation, and I hope to see you at our future presentations. Thank you.